The accomplishments on display at the summit gleamed, carefully wrapped in designer suits and polished smiles, concealing insecurities beneath layers of curated perfection. Yet for me, this gathering wasn't about pretense. It was a moment to share my story, to listen, and to expand the vision I had poured my heart into building. As I traced my fingers over the elegant embossing of the invitation, I couldn't help but reflect on the distance I had traveled. A decade ago, I would have scoffed at the thought of standing where I was now. 10 years earlier, I was lost, heartbroken, clawing my way out of the wreckage left by Daniel and Amanda's betrayal. My world back then was shattered, and I fought tooth and nail to reclaim a sense of control, to piece myself back together from the fragments of what they had left behind. The version of me who sat defeated and uncertain all those years ago would never have believed that this moment, this invitation, was possible. Accepting it had been instinctive, not out of a desire to prove myself to anyone, but as a celebration of everything I had become. It wasn't about appearances or validation. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the resilience that carried me through the darkest times, of the determination that built an empire brick by brick, scar by scar. This summit, more than a professional accolade, was a deeply personal milestone, a reminder of my strength and of the life I had created on my own terms. When the day of the event finally arrived, I walked into a grand hall alive with ambition. Industry titans surrounded me, their laughter and energy reverberating through the space. We were equals here, bound not by competition, but by shared stories of triumphs and failures, of lessons learned in moments of both glory and despair. The room buzzed with creativity and vision, a current so electric it reignited my belief in what I had built. As the week unfolded, I was surprised by an unexpected sense of peace. I realized that I wasn't there to outshine anyone or prove I belonged. I was there to honor my journey, the struggles, the pain, the rebuilding, and the growth. With each passing moment, Daniel and Amanda's betrayal, once a suffocating shadow, faded further from my thoughts. What had once been a painful burden became nothing more than a distant echo, a footnote in a much greater story. In the final session of the summit, I found myself on stage before a crowd of bright, driven individuals. Standing under the spotlight, I shared my story, not the details of the betrayal, not the names or specifics, but the lessons. I spoke of resilience, of finding purpose in the rubble, of channeling pain into strength. Adversity, I told them, does not define you. It is your response to it that shapes your future. The words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place of truth, shaped by years of struggle and triumph. As I stepped off the stage, the applause erupted into a standing ovation, filling the room with a warmth I hadn't expected. In that moment, I felt something shift within me. The ghosts of Daniel and Amanda, who had lingered in the shadows of my mind for so long, were finally gone. They weren't villains anymore, nor did they hold any power over me. They were merely catalysts, their betrayal the spark that ignited a transformation I hadn't realized I was capable of. Walking out of the summit, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Free from the pain I had carried. Free from the need to prove anything to anyone. What had started as a story of heartbreak and devastation had become one of strength and triumph. And as I stepped into the sunlight outside, I knew that my journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, I felt whole, ready to embrace whatever came next. The skyline shimmered in the distance, a horizon brimming with endless possibilities. The future wasn't about escaping the shadows of the past. It was about embracing the man I had become, the man who had risen from devastation, not merely surviving but thriving, with a purpose that transcended revenge. For the first time in years, I felt free. As I drove back to my hotel that evening, a profound sense of lightness washed over me. The summit had been more than a professional triumph. It was personal redemption. I had walked into that room carrying the weight of my history, but I left with something I hadn't realized I was missing. Peace, not the fleeting kind that comes from distractions or accomplishments, but a deeper calm that whispered, "You've made it. You're enough." That night, I sat on the balcony of my suite, gazing out at the sea of city lights. My thoughts wandered to the people who had shaped my journey, the ones who had lifted me, the ones who had doubted me, and even the ones who had betrayed me. Each of them, in their own way, had played a role in my story, whether as blessings, lessons, or challenges I had been forced to overcome. I realized then that their contributions, however painful, had been essential to the man I had become. As I was lost in reflection, my phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back to the present. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before opening the message, my heart skipping a beat as I read the words. "Kai, it's Daniel. Can we talk?" For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, unsure how to feel. A decade had passed since I'd last heard from him, and now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out. I wondered what he could possibly want. An apology? Closure? Or was it something else entirely? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and move on as if it had never appeared. But another part of me, the part that had once considered him family, felt a flicker of curiosity. I set the phone aside and stepped back inside, letting the message remain unanswered. For 10 years, I had rebuilt my life, creating something extraordinary from the ashes of his betrayal. Whatever Daniel wanted, it couldn't change the man I had become. The question, however, lingered in my mind long after I had put the phone down. I had spent years moving forward, deliberately locking the door to my past, but now, his message was like a crack in that door, tempting me to look back. For days, I debated whether to respond. Part of me was angry that after all these years, Daniel had the audacity to reach out. Another part of me was intrigued. What could he possibly say after a decade of silence? Was it an apology, a justification, or something else entirely? After a restless night, I finally replied. My message was brief, almost cold. "What do you want?" His response came quickly. "I need to see you. Please, just one conversation." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I thought about all the things I wanted to say if I met him, the questions I had, the pain I had buried, the anger I had suppressed. But as I sifted through my emotions, I realized something unexpected. The wounds he'd left behind had scarred over so completely that they barely hurt anymore. When we finally met, it was in a quiet cafe tucked away in the city. Daniel looked different, older, worn. There was a weight in his expression, a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a fleeting moment, I felt the ghost of our old friendship, the late-night conversations, the laughter, the bond we once shared. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the memory of his betrayal. Daniel was the first to speak. "I owe you an apology for everything," he said, his voice low and thick with regret. I stayed silent, letting him continue. "You didn't deserve what I did to you. I've lived with that guilt every single day. I thought I could bury it, but I can't. I needed to tell you, I'm sorry for betraying you, for ruining our friendship, for everything." I studied him, searching for sincerity in his words. He seemed genuine, his voice trembling under the weight of his guilt. But I had learned long ago that apologies don't undo damage. They don't erase pain, and they don't rebuild trust. "Why now?" I asked, my voice steady. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "Amanda and I, we're not together anymore. Haven't been for years. I thought about reaching out sooner, but I didn't think you'd want to hear it. But seeing how far you've come, I realized I had to try. Not for forgiveness, just to let you know I regret it." Hearing Amanda's name sent a pang through me, but it was muted, like pressing on an old bruise that no longer hurt. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man who had once been my brother. "You're right," I said after a long pause. "I don't forgive you. Not because I hate you, but because forgiveness isn't something I owe you. What you did, it shaped me. It taught me who I could trust and who I couldn't. It drove me to build the life I have now. So no, I don't forgive you, Daniel. But I don't hate you either, His face fell, but he nodded, as if he had expected as much. "I understand," he said quietly. I needed to say it, to own up to it." The conversation ended soon after. As I walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The chapter with Daniel and Amanda was finally over. Their ghosts, which had haunted me for so long, were laid to rest. For the first time in a decade, I felt truly free. Not because of Daniel's apology, but because I realized I had already moved on. My success, my happiness, my peace, they were mine and mine alone. They had never depended on him, or her, or anyone else. As I stepped into the cool evening air, I smiled. The future stretched out before me, bright and limitless. Daniel and Amanda had been a part of my story, but they didn't define it. I did. And my story was far from over.